Thanks for coming. My name is Massimo Refere. I'm a cloud architect in the cloud services business unit, and I'm delivering part of this presentation. Part of it is going to be delivered by Paco Gomez. He will introduce himself when he comes on stage. The usual disclaimer that we're not going to read. We're not going to talk too much about future stuff. This session is pretty much about what we have today, so the disclaimer is here because we have to have it, but we're not going to talk about many future things, even though we're going to allude to something here. I do have a proper agenda, but I thought that it would be good to have a visualization of it. So this is pretty much what the taxonomy of a stack is, which pretty much resembles how we're going to talk about stuff in this session. Okay, so what we are going to do is we are going to talk about the APIs that the service exposes, and then we're going to move up the stack and talking about SDKs and CLIs, primarily as CLIs, not so much about SDKs. And then we're going to talk and introduce the topic of how you are going to automate this, okay? And just to set more context about this, so that you are starting to kind of tune on the part that may be of more interest to you. So when we're going to talk about REST APIs and SDKs, even though, as I said, we're not going to talk about SDKs too much, but when we're going to talk about REST APIs, those of you that are in the business of integrating with the core service, you may want to pay more attention to that part, because that is how we are going to integrate your products maybe with the platform, right? And to support vCloud there as an extension of what your product does, for example. If you are more geared towards the end user or the customer that is consuming vCloud there for business reason, right, to run applications and things like that, you may be more interested in understanding the CLI part and the automation piece that I'm going to cover, although very briefly, towards the end of the presentation, because at the end, what you're interested in is how you are going to automate your stuff, leveraging vCloud there as an endpoint, rather than spending time to understand the REST APIs call that someone else may have done for you in those automation products. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. The other thing that I wanted to warn you about as we get into this presentation is that there is a difference between consuming a service, and this service in particular, from the UI compared to how you do that from the APIs, okay? So we're trying to do a good job at hiding a lot of the stuff that you will see in this presentation from a UI perspective, so that you do not get to understand what happens underneath. But the moment that you start consuming the service through APIs, you do need to understand those things, okay? Because there is no way that you can consume the service if you do not understand the construct behind it. And that's why we're going to spend part of this presentation not on the REST APIs code per se, but we're going to set the context and talk about, you know, the construct that we use in the service, so that when you run a REST API call, you know the context and you understand what you're doing, okay? So I'm usually using this parallel to describe the UI consumption and the API consumption, where the UI consumption is what we're trying to do is we're trying to have you sit in a business class seat, right? So you don't need to think about how the airplane works and anything. But when you're starting to consume the service through the APIs, you need to understand what's going on in the airplane, right? So that's kind of the best parallel that I could come up with. So fasten your seatbelt. This is the proper agenda, okay? So we're going to talk, as I mentioned, about this architectural background, so that you have a context of why you're using some, you know, APIs and not others APIs. And then we're going to talk a little bit more in details about those REST APIs, right? So just for you to understand this, I mean, this is a very broad and complex topic. So even though the session is advanced and we do have some example here, we're going to touch many things, so we need to go very quickly, and we cannot go very deep into any of those things, right? So it's a kind of an API primer that I'm going to cover. Then Paco is going to talk about the VCA CLI, which is the de facto standard CLI that we are suggesting to use along with Power CLI that I'm going to cover very quickly. And he will also have a demo of the VCA CLI. And then I'll come back on stage to briefly discuss some of the automation options and products and integrations that we're working on in the context of that slide that I was showing you, okay? So let's get started with this architectural background, naming conventions, and setting the context for what you're going to see. We're going to do this starting from a couple of years ago when we launched the service so that you get a little bit of history and all those pieces coming together to what we have today. So before we start, how many of you, by raise of hand, know vCloud Director? Okay, cool, cool. So the reason for which I'm asking the question is because we do use vCloud Director as a product to deliver what we call the compute service. As we go through the presentation, you will see that that becomes one of the services that we are delivering through vCloud Air. But the key point here is that when we started more than 2 years ago, when the service was called vCloud Hybrid Service, or VCHS, that was the only service that we had, right? So it was a hosted, so to speak, a hosted version of vCloud Director, okay? So that was kind of what you were interfacing with. And the way that it worked is that you would log in into the vCloud Air UI, or VCHS UI at that time. You would get, from an API consumption perspective, you would get the VCD endpoint to connect to your VCD org, so the VCD endpoint and the org name to connect to it. And then from that point on, it would be just regular vCloud Director consumption model through the APIs, okay? So that was okay, but since this is a distributed service, so we had capacity, you know, in many data centers, so with many vCloud Director instances across the globe, right? So UK, Germany, Asia Pacific, Australia, 4 locations in the US. It wasn't very convenient when you were talking to someone that wanted to consume the service through the API perspective and maybe integrate their product with vCloud Air. Oh yeah, you need to go to the UI, and you need to select your region, and then you need to get through the UI those endpoints, and then you can use those endpoints programmatically. It wasn't very, you know, API-driven approach. So what we have done a few months later, we introduced what we now call the VCHS platform, okay? So the VCHS platform is essentially an endpoint that is vchs.vmware.com that you can use from an API consumption perspective. You can log into that, and you can query the service. So it's a service discovery. It's a virtual data center service discovery feature that allows you to query the platform and say, tell me what capacity I have available and what the endpoints for that capacity is. Okay, so when you connect it to vchs.vmware.com, you would get all the virtual data center from a programmatic perspective with all the endpoints. So that is when it started to become more API friendly, the approach that we were taking. But yet, the VCHS platform was limited. The only thing that you could do with it was to get the endpoints of your virtual data centers. You couldn't do many things like managing, for example, users through the APIs or querying billing and metering stuff through the APIs. So we introduced I'm not going to cover why we introduced another platform instead of extending a new one, but the fact is that we introduced a new platform, which we call the VCA platform, okay, that does all of that. So it does have IAM features that you can consume through the API, billing, metering, and obviously virtual data center discovery, okay? So the reason for which I'm showing this is because you need to understand, and we hide this from the UI, right? So when you log into the UI, you have a navigation that kind of hides you from all of this. But if you start consuming the service through the APIs, you need, or the CLI, as Paco will demonstrate, you really need to understand all of this, okay? So the new platform, the VCA platform, is what we're using to plug new service into it. So you may have heard about the new object storage service and new services that are coming out like DB as a service and things like that. So the VCA platform is that service agnostic platform that we are using to plug all of those new services underneath it in a very modular way. So that's kind of the overarching platform that allows you to log in and query to get back not only the vCloud Director endpoints, because now vCloud Director becomes one of the many services that the platform support, but it will also give you the endpoints of the other services. And there are nuances and gotchas that I'm going to cover, but that's pretty much it. The VCHS platform remains, and it is pretty much geared towards a set of compute capacity characteristic that we refer to as a dedicated cloud. So we do have many SKUs or many flavors of compute instances inside vCloud Air, one of which is the dedicated cloud, and that is driven by the VCHS platform. Again, and I want to repeat this, from a UI perspective, we pretty much kind of hide all of these, but if you're going to consume this through the API, you really need to understand the layout of this slide, okay? So let's get more into the details now that we have this kind of naming convention set, like the VCHS platform, the VCA platform, and the compute service, okay? So if you follow what I'm trying to say, it becomes very easy to understand this concept of the handoff, okay? So the concept of the handoff is very important because the way that you're going to consume this and interface with this is that you're going to connect to the platform, right? Or that's kind of an option, an approach that I'm going to show you. And then you're going to interact with the platform to ask the platform, let me know what the endpoint of this particular service or instance that I own is, okay? So that's kind of where you have a handoff from the platform into the specific service, and I have an example for that, okay? So one of the approaches that we're suggesting is this, okay? So you log into the platform, right, vca.vmware.com. That's actually the API endpoint. So if you have a REST client, that's the endpoint that you need to use. You retrieve the parameters to connect to the service, so that there are APIs that allows you to tell the platform, get me all the services and the instances of the service that I own across all regions, and the service will respond back, the platform will respond back with those parameters, okay? So this is where the hands-off happens, okay? So basically you're querying the platform will tell you, for example, and I have this example here in a minute. Let's get to this one, because pretty much the previous slide were a description of what I'm saying here. This is an example of a response from the platform, okay? So the platform will respond to a REST query in JSON, the parameters to connect to that VCD endpoint. That's the handoff, okay? So essentially, if you scroll and if you parse that JSON response, you will see what you used to see in the UI in terms of the endpoint for that particular VCD instance. From this point on, when the handoff happens, That's exactly how you would consume vCloud Director pretty much. Okay, so that's kind of where the platform hands off to the service all the essentially methods and characteristics of consuming that particular service through the API. So for those of you that have used vCloud Director and for those of you that have been using the vCloud Director APIs, you will recognize these very easily, right? So this is the API endpoint for the vCloud Director US California region. So we do have a vCloud Director instance in California to deliver the compute service there. If I was going to use the instance in Australia, it would have been AU for Australia dash whatever, I don't remember the exact fully qualified domain name, but that would have been another vCloud Director instance in another region. And then you see here the org name that you need to use to log into that instance. Okay? So this is another kind of view of the very same thing where you have the instance ID from the service controller, and that instance ID will contain the org name and the vCloud Director API endpoint, and from that point on, it's just, you know, vCloud Director compute service that you are going to consume. I'm using vCloud Director here as an example of a service instance because, as you could see, many people know vCloud Director, so they're kind of familiar. We could run through the same thing with the database as a service that we have in beta right now. So you would query the platform to ask them, let me know what instance of database as a service I have available. The JSON would appear pretty much different than this one because the API endpoints and stuff are different, but the concept is very similar. The moment that you have those parameters that you need to use to connect to that service, then you turn your attention to that service and you use those parameters to connect to that service. Another good example of this is how we're doing stuff with Google, for example. So you heard that we have announced this partnership with Google where we are essentially using their object storage, right? So here there are some caveats, right? Because not all of the services have these clean, clean kind of behavior. So for Google storage, what you need to do is you need to still go through the UI to get the keys that you need to connect to that service. So it's a little bit of a non-example in this context. I apologize if it is a little bit confusing, but I wanted to stress on the notion, on the concept of the handoff. So basically what happens, regardless that, unfortunately, as of today, you need to do that in the UI and not in the APIs, but what happens is that you connect to the service, you get those keys, and then you turn your attention using those keys and knowing the Google Object Storage endpoint to the Google service. From that point on, it is just as if you were consuming the native Google service, which is the native Google service, okay? So we use the platform like, you know, kind of an overarching framework to plug all of these services together where you can get the information. For Google, as I said, it's not in the API query in the platform, it's still in the UI, but the concept of the handoff, it is pretty much the same. Okay? And then inside the organization, you can have multiple virtual data center. So for those of you that have already used the service, this is what happens when you click on a region. So you log in, you click on the tile that describes the compute service, you click on a region, and on the left-hand side, you see the VDCs, the virtual data center. What you have done in the UI, when you do that, when you click on the region, basically you have gone through, in the backend, through this process here, and what's listed on the left-hand side are these virtual data centers that you have created, okay? And you can create more virtual data centers in an on-demand service inside that organization which maps the region. Okay? So going back to those REST API, when you have this done and when you have this clear, what you can do, and for those of you that have used vCloud Director, this should be pretty familiar if you have used the APIs. This is what you have to do to deploy a VM. And obviously, we're not going to get into the details of this command here. So I'm saying that it's here just to scare you. Because essentially, what I'm trying to build up in this presentation is an escalation in simplicity, so to speak, where if you're connecting to the service at this level, it's pretty raw, right? So you really need to understand not only the structure of the object and the construct, but you really need to deal with raw REST APIs call. This call is just to instantiate a VM, right? So you really need to be very much into this. What we want to do as we go forward with the presentation is to show you that as you move up the stack, APIs, CLIs, and automation tools, these things become easier to call from an automation and from a CLI perspective, right? Because we're going to abstract more and more and more as we move up into the stack, and as Paco is going to show you in a few minutes, okay? Yeah, we have been talking about these and the caveats for the Google Object Storage and stuff. Okay, so now we're going to switch quickly into the CLIs, okay, and we're going to move up the stack a little bit. So we're going to talk about VCS CLI, as I said. VCS CLI, Paco is going to talk about this in more details also with the demo. But VCS CLI is the de facto standard CLI that we're suggesting to use for the service, and that has been built using the vCloud Python SDK that we're not going to talk about here, but just for your information, there is an existing Python SDK that you could use and that Paco used and the engineering team has used to build this CLI. Okay, so the CLI is an instance, is an application that is using and leveraging that that Python SDK. And then we're going to touch very, very briefly on Power CLI. How many of you are using Power CLI to manage the vSphere environment that you have? Okay, cool. So this is a very, very brief comparison. We do not want them to compete, but just to set kind of when you want to use one over the other. In my opinion, VCS CLI is the more complete. It does have a huge coverage in terms of APIs that we expose. It does also support some of the beta stuff that you have. Whereas Power CLI has the advantage of being very commonly used, right? So if you're very much into PowerShell and Power CLI, it's easier to get up to speed with the new CMD-lets that we have to connect to vCloud Air and the vCloud Air services. It is more limited in terms of features and functionality compared to VCS CLI, but it does have that other advantage, okay? So just to set, so that when you install those new CMD-lets, you understand what you're doing. Going back to this slide here about the two different platforms, like the VCHS platform and the VCA platform, where we have compute subscription that could connect to both of them. So when you install Power CLI 6.0, I think R1, that was the case, you get asked if you want to install vCloud Air / VCD Power CLI. What does that mean? Essentially, this is what it means, okay? So the traditional, so we have had Power CLI support for vCloud Director for a long time, and that is what the cloud module is all about. Okay, so if you install that module, you can talk directly to the compute service in in vCloud Air. What the vCloud Air CMDlet does is it will allow you to interact with the platform. Okay, so for example, through through Power CLI, what you could do is you could connect to the VCHS or the VCA platform and ask Power CLI, give me a list of the virtual data center that I have across the globe. And Power CLI will tell you, oh, I've just logged into your vCloud Air account, and I see that you have 17 virtual data centers, 4 of which in the US, 3 of which in Germany, 2 of which in the UK, and 7, whatever, I lost the math, whatever, 7 of which in Australia, okay? So that is what this pCloud module allows you to do. There is a hands-off that happens as well. So the moment that you have identified that virtual data center that you want to work with, then is when you start using those cloud CMDlets to interact with that vCloud Director instance. So there is a concept of a handoff in Power CLI as well, because it pretty much maps the backend and the construct in the backend. Okay? So if you search for Power CLI and vCloud Air, you will find a few blog posts that will guide you through how to set this up and how to what the most common commands that you can use to explore vCloud Air are. We do not have time to go through all of those stuff here, but if you search on the web, you'll see lots of those blog posts. And now I'm going to give the stage to Paco for the VCA deep dive in the VCA CLI, and then come back with the automation piece.
Thank you, Massimo. Hello, my name is Paco Gomez. I'm a senior solution architect at vCloud Air, and I'm going to introduce you to the command line interface to vCloud Air. I'm happy to see many people using vCloud Director as well. VCA CLI is a command line interface for vCloud Director standalone as well as vCloud Air. It works for both type of software, both for on-premise vCloud Director, what we call a standalone, and also for vCloud Air in the cloud. It's a command line interface and written in Python. It's open source. It's available to download for free. You can use it to operate your vCloud Director instance as well as operate your vCloud Air account. So it offers the same functionality as the portal interface, but from a command line interface. What that means is that it allows you to do things like lightweight automation. You can put a bunch of scripts in a script file and run that script, and it will execute all the actions that you would otherwise do in the portal. It not only supports most of the portal functionality, but it also enables other functionality that is not available in the portal, and I'll cover that functionality in the next slide. It's multi-platform, so if you usually work on Windows, you can download it from the Python website, PIP, and run it from there. If you usually work on Linux, you can do it as well, or if you work with a Mac, like I do, you can download it with a Mac and use it from the Mac. Some of the features that are unique and that is enabled by the CLI is in this list. The vCloud has a lot of functionality, the vCloud API, as Massimo mentioned, but some of that functionality is not available in the portal, so it is available through the CLI in a very easy to consume way. One functionality is, for instance, to create independent disks. So I don't know if you know, but in vCloud Director, it is possible to create independent disks that are not tied to a VM. You can create it independently and then attach that disk to a VM. So while the portal is able to list the independent disks that you have created, it doesn't provide a way to create those disks. You have to go through the API to do it. But with the CLI, you can easily create a disk and attach it to a VM. You can also reconfigure VPN tunnels. So if you have a VPN tunnel, you create a VPN tunnel through the CLI, and then later if you want to add another network to that VPN tunnel, you can do it without having to delete that VPN tunnel and recreate it. So you can do that. You can initialize a VM with public SSH keys. So, and this is the demo that I'm going to do in a moment. So usually when you use the portal to create a VM, you create the VM, you select the template, create the VM, you go through the steps, specify the memory, CPU, etc. And then you will get a generated password in the portal, and then you have to take note of that password and log in into the portal with that password. And then you have to configure the NAT, the Edge Gateway rules, to allow the SSH into the machine. So one way you can do it with the CLI, with the command line interface, is that you can create a VM, customize it with injecting the public SSH key, and then configure the Edge Gateway with the rules to allow SSH into the machine, and then finally, when everything is done, just SSH into the machine and not having to go through the web interface at all. So that allows a full automation of the creation of a VM that is ready to SSH into. It supports multiple profiles, so you may log in into a virtual data center with one profile, and you may log in into another virtual data center with another profile and switch back and forth profiles as part of your typical use of vCloud. The results are returned in a table, but it also returns results in JSON format. So if you want to automate some scripts, you want to create some scripts, you can parse that result in JSON and extract a particular value that will be an input for the next step. And it's being actively used by VCA customers and vCAN partners. So how many of you have heard about VCA CLI or have used it? Okay, a couple. Okay, very good. So I have categorized all the VCA CLI commands in these 5 categories: general, for login, logout, profile, etc. User management, it is possible to create roles and users. Compute, that's the compute services, that service that Massimo was referring to. So you can work with virtual data centers, catalog, vApps, virtual machines, and disks. Network, this is a very comprehensive list of functionality where you can create networks, allocate public IPs in vCloud Air, configure rules, NAT rules and firewall rules, and configure VPN. And this is about application blueprints. We have in beta a service to deploy blueprints, and we have a few commands to handle that. So here's an example where you can log in into vCloud Air, passing the user ID and the password, and then getting a list of instances available with your account. And then you can use a particular instance, passing the instance ID and also passing the virtual data center ID. And finally, once you are in that virtual data center, then you can list the VMs. You can have a list of VMs. You can do all that in one single command. And just to give you an idea, an overview, you probably are aware of this, and Massimo touched on this as well. When you log in, you have access to different regions in vCloud Air. Those regions are instances, and inside each instance you can have one or more virtual data centers. And a virtual data center is the location where you can deploy virtual machines or VApps into. And each virtual data center has an edge gateway that can have one or more public IPs to allow access to the machines from outside. So this type of navigation is what you will do when you log in into vCloud Air. I have an example here where you can log in into vCloud Director standalone. So if you are a regular user of a vCloud Director instance, you can use the CLI for that. You just need to pass the host of the virtual VCD instance, as well as the version, and then the OR and the VDC. The OR is the organization where your account is allocated. And then once you log in, you have the same visibility over virtual machines and edge gateways. In general, the syntax of the VCA CLI commands is you specify the object that you want to interact with, the entity, and then the verb that you want to execute against that instance. And then after that, you can have one or many parameters to specify the options. So for instance, if you want to list the VApps, you pass the noun VApp and then the list. If you want to create a VApp, just pass the create verb and then the arguments after that. If you don't have to go to the manual to get examples, you can run the example command to get a list of about 100 examples of how to use the CLI. Then on this column you will see what command is applicable to what flavor of vCloud, if it's standalone or vCloud Air. So in the demo that I'm going to run here is a recorded demo. It takes about a couple of minutes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a virtual machine that is ready to use. So I can SSH into that machine after the machine has been created. So the 4 steps that we are going to take here is to create the VM from a template, then inject the public SSH key that I have so I can SSH into that VM. I inject this public SSH key through a process, through a customization process, guest customization process that vSphere and vCloud supports. Then I'm going to configure the edge gateway to allow incoming inbound SSH traffic into that VM. And finally, I'm just going to SSH into the machine. So I have a demo here. It's a recorded demo. So I have the VCA CLI commands in a shell script file. So when I execute this shell script file, all these commands will be executed, and as a result, I will be able to SSH into the VM. In addition to creating the VM and injecting the SSH key, I am also adding 3 commands here, VCA CLI commands, to create a virtual data center. So I'm logging into a VDC instance, and I'm creating a brand new virtual data center. That is going to create an edge gateway, and it will allow me to start from scratch. Okay? Then I'm going to execute the use command to start using that, to access that virtual data center that I just created. And then I'm going to create also a user with this user create command. And I'm going to pass these arguments, and that will create the user. After that, the VApp create is going to create a VM from a public catalog, which is a CentOS template. Then I'm going to specify the network that this VM is going to be connected to. that will be a VDC internal network. Next step is to customize it. So I'm going to pass a customization file that will inject the SSH key, and then I will extract the the IP assigned to that virtual machine with this command here. So basically, I'm showing the JSON representation of that virtual machine, and then I'm extracting the IP property. And then I'm adding a public IP. I'm allocating a public IP into the gateway. And finally, the last two commands are to configure the edge gateway. I'm going to show you these commands in a moment as well. So this is the script being executed. I just compressed the time a little bit, so we don't have to go through the whole process, but this takes a few minutes. So here, the VDC has been created. In this command, it's going to create the VDC. The first few commands are just logging into the VDC. After this, the VDC has been created. I'm listing the templates available in my account. You can see the CentOS is one of those templates. Then I'm going to create a virtual machine VApp based on that template. In this step is customizing the VM with the CPUs and memories that I specify in the command. Is customizing the memory, and then is connecting the virtual machine into the local network. After that is deploying the virtual machine, is going to extract the IP, and then also is going to allocate a public IP, and then is going to configure the edge gateway with the NAT rules. And then once everything is done, I can SSH as shown here into the VM, and I can show you that the IP has been allocated. And if I do ifconfig here, I can see the private IP. This is the email address, the email confirmation email that the user got when it was created by the command, and here the VM has been created and is shown in the portal. So for your reference, I have these steps in the slides, and the slides will be available after the presentation in the website of the conference. So this is for your reference, all the steps that we just did here. With that, I'll give you back control.
Cool. So hopefully you have seen how we move from, consuming the service from raw REST APIs, which is kind of, very complex, to a more abstracted way to do these things. So if we were doing this exact thing using raw REST APIs, it would have been way more complex, right? Because you need to really talk, at a lower level compared to this one. So let's move on and kind of introduce very briefly to this automation stuff. So before we get into that, and part of that, I think that it is important to clear the table from lots of misunderstanding that are happening when we talk to customers about what we provide and what the customer is responsible for and things like that. So essentially, who is running these automation stuff? And in this slide, I'm trying to put together kind of the options that you have or that exist to automate this stuff. So the very first example and the very first option is pretty much what Paco was showing, right? So yourself with your laptop connecting through the internet to the service and consuming those REST API and that API surface that the service exposes, right? So pretty much what Paco was mentioning. Similarly, what you could have is in your on-prem enterprise data centers, where you may have tools like Chef, for example, I'm mentioning here, but just as an example, that integrates with those APIs. So from your on-prem data center, you can run these receipts or whatever to drive behavior inside the vCloud Air service. So that would be another option, which is typically what most customers are doing right now. Another option that is, kind of confusing for some people is this one. So you still own the management tool, and in this case, I'm mentioning vRealize Automation or vRealize Orchestrator. It could be pretty much everything. It could be the same Chef or whatever. But the key point here is that you still own that environment. You manage that automation environment. It just happens to run in the same platform that you are trying to automate, right? So instead of instantiating a VM in your own data center to drive behavior through the internet, like in this example here, you prefer to instantiate a VM and run the very same tool inside the service to talk to the very same service. I know that it's kind of, easy, but lots of, people get confused about this notion, right? So are you giving, VRA and VRO as a service? This is not VRA and VRO as a service. This is just happening to run in vCloud Air, but you own it, right? Which is, yes. Oh, yeah, I'll repeat the question.
Can you connect back to your on-premise infrastructure?
Yes, you can connect back. So the question was, can you connect back to your on-prem infrastructure? And the answer is yes, you can. There is a lot of network flexibility that could happen here, which we're not covering, but Paco mentioned the concept of the edge gateway. So through the edge gateway that exists inside your virtual data center here, you can create VPN connection to your environment. Can we postpone the question at the end so that we finish this one? Just to close on this one.
So you weren't inside before.
You can connect back to your on-prem data center. So if you have a tool inside a vCloud Air, it could talk back to your on-prem data center. The other option, and the example here is what we have done with Bitnami, which is a SaaS-based service that you can use, particularly their Launchpad, that you can use to instantiate VMs inside vCloud Air, along with other clouds, obviously. So essentially, this is a tool that is delivered as a service. So you need to connect to vmware.bitnami.com to get access to that service. And if you put the credential of your vCloud Air account, you will be able to spin up their own templates inside vCloud Air, right? So essentially, what they're doing is they're still pretty much talking to the very same REST APIs, but the implementation of the integration is done very differently. The last option would be something like this. We do not have, as of today, any publicly available as a service offering, but these would be totally different from this one. So this would be a managed service of some sort. So at VMware US, we have previewed a new service called the vCloud Air Blueprinting Service. So this is a managed service that we manage for you that allows you to create scripts based on the Tosca declarative language that allows you to drive behavior inside vCloud Air. Okay, so it's a tool that allows you to build a Tosca script, so to speak, and Paco is kind of very much into that. So if you are interested, you can talk to Paco, where you can write your declarative script and run it, and we will run it for you in the backend using an automation tool that you don't see. You just see the service surfacing to you. Okay, so these are kind of the options that exist today, other than this, which is more like a future thing. Okay, So if you want to get more information about those tools that we integrate with, you should go to this website, which is where we try to kind of summarize what we have over there. The tools that you're going to see in the next few slides and the checkbox and everything are just for, I call it for illustration purposes, just to give you an idea. Always refer to these website for the latest on what we integrate with, the level of integration and things like that, okay? But just to give you an idea of what we're trying to do is, if you look at the ecosystem around us and in the industry at large, I try to separate these in this sort of quadrant where I'm showing here the VMware tools and the third-party tools and the infrastructure automation tools and the applications automation tools. So to make it kind of brief, in the VMware world, we do have tools that tend to be slightly more oriented to manage and to automate the infrastructure layer. We do have tools that get into more like the application realm, like CodeStream and other stuff. And then there is a bunch of other tools, I would say industry standard tools, like Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Cloudify, which is the technology that we use in the backend for that managed service. And then other tools that are more into the application space. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to be a legit endpoint for all of these tools so that when you have to automate stuff, you don't have to just write a bunch of REST API calls or using a CLI, which is always an option. But if you really want to go to the next step, you could then use one of these tools that we also kind of try to segment for clarity where they're focused on, right? So most of our tools are focused on data center optimization and things like that, whereas these other tools are more focused on public cloud, web scale kind of stuff. So you can also see these like a DevOps-ish zone sort of things, whereas this is more the VMware champion zone, right? But what we're trying to do really here is to work on every one of these products. Obviously, we have a roadmap, and we cannot throw like 10,000 people to work on 20,000 products essentially. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to pick those that are most useful to the customers that are using them to automate stuff and create connections and integrations into vCloud Air, right? So one of the examples would be Ansible. Right? And I picked this example because I've been working on this stuff in the last few months, so I'm more familiar with this than with other stuff, but pretty much we have done similar things. So what we have done with Ansible is we created additional modules that connects to vCloud Air and allows you to deploy VMs or VApps, configure the edge gateway with NAT and firewall rules so that you can run basically an Ansible playbook and deploy a VApp, configure the edge gateway, and then use Ansible to install middleware and the application all in one go, right? So if you want to know more about this stuff and some, some demos and stuff, I'm doing a session tonight at 5 p.m. in the Hank space where I'm going to show some of this stuff here. And as you can see, what we do here is we kind of, at the very high level, we create this declarative script where we say, I want to use service type VCD. In these cases, I want to talk to VCD directly, which could be either the VCD inside vCloud Air, the compute service, if I know already the endpoint, or it could be your VCD inside your data center. It could be a VCD instance in a vCAN context, vCloud Air network provider, network partner context. Or I can talk to VCA and go through all of that service discovery that we have been talking about at the very beginning, okay? So if you want to know more and see more about this, come to that session later on. So in conclusion, before we take a few questions. If we have time, yes, we do have some time. In conclusion, what we have seen basically is a kind of an introduction to those concept and construct that you really need to understand when you start using the service through the APIs. And we went through basic REST APIs experience, so to speak. We went through the CLI options that we have with what Paco showed for VCSEL, and a very light introduction to the automation options that we have and what we're trying to achieve in that space, which is pretty much two things, right? So becoming a legit endpoint for those dozens of hundreds of products out there that many customers are using so that they can start consuming vCloud Air as well in some of the context. But also we're trying to pick some of these technologies and delivering these technologies as a service, like the blueprinting service that I was mentioning a few minutes ago. And of course at this website, there are all the latest in terms of what we integrate with and code samples and things like that. So with that said, was there another question over there?
My question was actually related to vRealize automation and whether or not it's
Oh, can you use the microphone?
So my question relates to vRealize automation and whether or not the cloud edition of that is able to manage on-premise infrastructure, because there's a lot of components in building that yourself.
So is the question whether you could have vRealize automation inside vCloud Air managing your environment back on-prem? So the answer to that question is yes, you can. In terms of technologically, nothing will stop you from deploying a vRealize automation instance inside vCloud Air, because at the end of the day, we use vSphere and everything, so you can just install whatever you want in there. It is not a use case that we're pushing right now. There are discussions and ideas on how to SaaSify those products. So instead of approaching these in the context that you were mentioning, like, can I take the bits and install them in vCloud Air so that I can connect back? So making these more like a SaaS-based consumption model for the vRealize products. And some of them are already kind of in that in that context available for consumption. I don't remember exactly which one of the vRealize branded products are available. Surely not vRealize automation, but that's kind of what we're moving towards. So we can have maybe a private chat about what the options are if you want to run this stuff in vCloud Air. But that's pretty much the idea. From a technology perspective, vCloud Air is just an extension of your data center. So you do have the option of installing your stuff either on-prem or off-prem with pretty much the same experience. But it goes back to what's being pushed right now in terms of support and the use case validation from the engineering and the support team. Is there any other question before we're closing down? Nope. Okay, cool. It was either very clear or it was like, wow. No, thanks for coming and enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.